only perform salah behind an imam of that particular school. So as a result of this, the Shafi'is would always be first, followed by the Hanafis, followed by the Malikis, followed by the Hanbalis. So, Fajr, the adhan for the Shafi'is, followed by the adhan for the Hanafis, followed by the adhan for the Malikis, followed by the adhan for the Hanbalis, and by that time I'm guessing the Shafi'is are done praying their sunnahs, so they're going to start praying their salah, right? And once they're done performing their salah, then it's going to be the Hanafis, then it's going to be the Malikis, then the Hanbalis, and except for Maghrib, right? So Izzuddin ibn al-Salaam, he narrates from Ibn Jubayr. Ibn Jubayr went there in the 6th century of the Hijrah, and he noticed this. He is a famous, he's a famous scholar. So he says that I noticed this, and everything is normally fine because everybody's praying at different times except Maghrib. He said the thing what would happen at Maghrib time is everybody gives the adhan together, right? Why? Because Maghrib, it is mustahab to perform as soon as possible. So the Hanafis didn't want to wait for the Shafis to finish. And if the Hanafis weren't waiting, then why would the Malikis and the Hanbalis wait? So everybody would give adhan together. And he said everybody would pray at the same time. When I say together, meaning, there are 4 different adhans happening. But, they're happening at the same time. And he said that then the salah would also happen at the same time. So he said that, because this is the haram, there are thousands of people there. He said that I could hear the qira'ah of the other imam. And, I'm getting confused whether this is the Allahu Akbar of my imam or that imam. So one of the few good things that the Al Saud they did do upon establishing power at that time is they unified the Jama'ah in the Haramain. So that's something that's a little interesting for you. But why am I mentioning it over here? According to some historical narrations, we see that the Ottomans allowed the Zaydiyah to have their musalla in Haram. The Zaydiyah. That's how close they were. The Ottomans were, if there's one thing about the Ottomans, it is their aqeedah was pristine and pure throughout their reign. Right? So other dynasties, they suffered from some tashayyuh here, and some funny people came in the middle over there, and all of this happened, but this never happened in the Ottomans. The Ottomans were always Sunni, and they always stuck to their aqeedah, and this has nothing to do with it, but the state-sponsored school was Hanafi Islam. So that's why the majority of the world is Hanafi, because by virtue of the Ottomans, right? So they allowed the Zaydiyah there because they are so similar in their aqeedah, and they also allowed them to remain the imams of Yemen. And basically what the imam would do, he would still be under the Ottoman Khalifa, but he would be the sovereign of that area, basically, right? And like the Hijaz, the Ottomans didn't really interfere with the inner goings on of what the Zaydiyah Imam wanted within Yemen. And just for your information, even today, the Zaydiyah in Yemen, they are about 30%. So even today they are a minority, and even at that time they were a minority. But they were the imams, and for the most part they were a very lenient, easygoing people. And even their imam, he would, one of their main beliefs is they don't believe in taqiyya. So that famous, you can lie to people who are not Muslim, and you can lie to the Ahlul Sunnah. They don't believe in that. So that's not one of their beliefs. They also pray very similar to us. They don't believe that their imam is ma'asum, is free from sin. So they do believe in the concept of imamah, but they don't believe all of those very far-fetched things. And they don't make takfir of any of the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Zaydiyah don't. And they also they have a different view of the Ahlul Bayt than some of the very extreme views held by the 12er school of the Shia, and also the 7 school of the Shia. So they are different in this regard. And just very briefly, Sulaiman the Magnificent, so that's Sulaimaniya Mosque in Istanbul. So in the 10th century, so he is the 10th, sorry, not the 10th century, in the 16th century, Yemen came under his control, and he is actually Sulaiman. He is called they call him Qanuni, Sulaiman al-Qanuni, Sulaiman the lawgiver. He is the longest reigning Ottoman Khalifa in the 16th century. Iran Iran was under Safavid control since 1501. Safavids are actually the people who established Iran as a Shia stronghold. Before that, Iran was always Sunni. In fact, some of our most famous scholars throughout our history, they are from that very region. Many of you might have heard of Imam Hakim al-Naysaburi, rahimahullah. Imam Hakim was also traces his origins to this region, the one who is the author of Mustadrak. Mustadrak is a very famous book of hadith, and many others. So if any of us have studied grammar in the Arabic language, you might have heard the name of Sibawayh. Sibawayh was from Iran. So all of these are Sunni scholars. But the Safavids is led by Ismail al-Safawi in 1501 as a rebellion against the Ottoman rule. They established the Shi'ism as the state-sponsored school, and this lasted for nearly 200 years. And one very important thing that we have to remember over here, the Safavids, they were Shia, and they were very extreme in their beliefs. In fact, there are multiple historical narrations of forced conversions to Shi'ism under the Safavid rule, especially under the first Safavid ruler, Ismail al-Safawi. So areas of the world like Azerbaijan and Armenia, who today are majority Shia areas, they were traditionally Sunni areas, but there were forced conversions that took place under Ismail al-Safawi during his time. And so what was happening during the time of Shah Waliullah, basically, in 1722, the Persian campaign of Peter the Great. So Peter the Great, the Russian ruler, he invaded Iran and he took many areas, and the Safavid dynasty was gone by then, but they took many areas during that time, and Iran was forced to surrender a lot of its area, and this was all happening during the time of, he was called Ashraf Hotak, so the Hotak dynasty of Iran. Then we have Nadir Shah. Now, who is Nadir Shah? He is an important figure, so just take a minute to understand who he is. Nadir Shah was a general in the renegade army of Tahmasp II. Tahmasp II, he broke off, basically. He broke off from the central Hotak dynasty, and he was a renegade. Basically, he rebelled against the ruler, and Nadir Shah was a general in his army, and one thing, the Hotaks are actually from Afghanistan. So Nadir Shah, he helped him, and he stopped the Russians by 1733. And Nadir Shah, in 1737, the Safavid dynasty officially ended, and Nadir Shah, he took control of Iran, basically, right? Nadir Shah took control of Iran, and Nadir Shah was actually Sunni. So this is the interesting thing over here, and this is a difference between the Western historians and the Eastern historians. So according to Sheikh Abu al-Hasan Ali al-Nadwi rahimahullah, Nadir Shah was on a campaign to reconvert the Iranian people to Sunni Islam. And according to Western historians, they would say that there was no such campaign. What was happening was just as a result of some of the iron fist policies of Nadir Shah within Iran, there was a rebellion against him. Whereas it looks like the opinion of the Sheikh is that he was actually active in trying to persuade people to return to the Sunnah. Anyways, that was Nadir Shah. He was killed by one of his own tribesmen, and after Nadir Shah, infighting broke out within their ranks. And moving on to Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Durrani, he was the ruler of Afghanistan. He's the one who invaded Delhi many times during his rule. And Ahmad Shah Durrani, He's actually said to have been a very pious leader. So he was a God-fearing person, and as a result, he had a great respect for the scholars of his time. So this is, we spoke about Hijaz, we spoke about Iran, we spoke about Yemen, we spoke about Afghanistan. This is what was the Ottoman rule. This is what was happening. This was the political climate during the time. All of these events, they're taking place during the time of Shah Waliullah Muhaddith al-Dehalwi rahimahullah, and especially in the Hijaz, that happens that 1730, 31, and 32. This when that infighting was happening in the Sharif family, that was the exact time that Shah Waliullah happened to be in the Haramain. Now, a little bit about the father. Shah Waliullah's father, he was a Sufi sheikh, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit about Sufism and its practices in India at that time, right? So it's a little disclaimer over here. The concept of tasawwuf or tazkiyah, is the purification of oneself. And this is a concept that we find in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the exact word, that one of the responsibilities of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that he provides tazkiyah, that he trains you to purify yourself, your soul, right? وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, right? So the concept itself is found in the Sunnah, and it's found in the Quran, it's found in the Sunnah, and it is supported by many narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself and the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That being said, a lot of people took it a little bit too far, and in the name of tasawwuf, in the name of tazkiyah, many things began to happen that had no relationship to the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And this is sort of what was happening in India during the time of Shah Waliullah Muhaddith al-Dehalwi rahimahullah. Shah Waliullah actually wrote a book about his father. So his father was a sheikh in the Naqshbandiya order of Tasawwuf, and the Naqshbandiya, they're even around today, and many of our mashayikh from that region, they also are affiliated with the Naqshbandiya order of Tasawwuf. Shah Waliullah wrote a book about his father, and this book was titled Bawariqul Wilaya. Bawariqul Wilaya, and it's also commonly known as Anfasul Arifin. Anfasul Arifin means the whispers of saints, basically. So here, this is actually sort of like a biography of his father. Shah Waliullah's father, he was born in 1644 and he passed away in 1718. His name was Abdul Rahim. Abdul Rahim, Shah Abdul Rahim, he was a scholar himself, and he is actually the one who established Madrasa Rahimiyya, where Shah Waliullah later began to teach. So that madrasa, we'll talk a little bit more about it briefly, but this is now one interesting thing about Shah Waliullah's father, Shah Abdul Rahim. Many of you might have heard of the famous book Fatawa Alamgiri. Fatawa Alamgiri. Fatawa Alamgiri, or it's actually titled Al-Fatawa Al-Hindiya, the Fatawa, the collection of Fatawa from the Indian subcontinent, but it's famously known as Fatawa Alamgiri because it was Aurangzeb he issued the edict for the compilation of these fatwas, and he was actually very intimately involved in the preparation and the compilation of that book. And it said that he would even have portions of the book read aloud to him. That's the ruler of that time, of the entire nation. He took out the time to actually sit and have those pages read to him on a daily basis. Shah Abdul Rahim, he was one from a group of 22 chosen scholars. So out of the entire, that's the entire India, and we're talking about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that entire area, I remind you, he was one of just 22 scholars who were chosen to assist in the compilation of that book. So he was a scholar in his own merit. And one other interesting thing over here is Aurangzeb is said to have spent 200,000 rupees on the preparation of that book. So, adjusted for inflation, we're looking at about 100,000 Canadian dollars today, right? 100,000 Canadian dollars. So imagine that, for the preparation of one book, Aurangzeb spent that. So he was a man who did have a love for knowledge, and this is something that's quite unique and remarkable for a ruler of his time. Most rulers were usually up to no good. So that's him having such a keen interest in the compilation of this book. This is something that speaks volumes regarding his character. And another interesting thing over here that's mentioned is, generally speaking, the Indian subcontinent, everybody is Hanafi, except for some areas of India that are port cities that sometimes their residents are Shafi'i, right? So there was never, I don't know about today, but historically speaking, the Maliki and the Hanbali schools, they never had any followers in the Indian subcontinent. There are very, very few Shafi'is. The majority, the overwhelming majority, was Hanafi. But regarding Shah Abdul Rahim, so this is the father of Shah Waliullah. Shah Waliullah, he mentions himself that he was a Hanafi in his own school, but he did have some opinions that strayed from the popular Hanafi opinion. So he mentions he mentions one of them. He mentions that my father was of the opinion that even when performing salah behind the imam, one should still recite Surah Al-Fatiha. So this is not the Hanafi opinion, right? The Hanafis say that if you're performing salah with the imam, then you don't recite anything. You just stay silent. This is Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah's opinion, that behind the imam you still recite Surah Al-Fatiha, because la salata illa bi Fatihatil Kitab. There is no salah without Fatihatul Kitab, without Surah Al-Fatiha. So this is his opinion, and Shah Abdul Rahim was also of this opinion. Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, he was born in the year 1114 of the Hijrah, so that's 1703 Common Era, in Fulat, and that is in the Muzaffarnagar district of India. And at the time of his birth, Shah Abdul Rahim was 60 years old. Right? So his father, when Shah Waliullah was born, his father was 60 years old. And he memorized the Quran at a very young age. And interesting thing over here, he did, later on in his life, he did criticize many of the practices prevalent in many of the Sufi orders of his day. But at that time, he did make bay'ah to his father in the Naqshbandiya chain of Tasawwuf. Shah Waliullah was his first marriage was during the life of his father, when Shah Waliullah he was 14 years old. So when he was 14 years old, he married his cousin, and they had one son, but there is not a lot known about this particular son. Then his wife passed away, and his second marriage was with a woman by the name of Karima bint Thanaullah. Karima bint Thanaullah was the daughter of one of the sheikhs, and with this second wife of his, he had 4 sons. So these sons are important because these are the ones that actually carried on his legacy. So Shah Abdul Aziz, Shah Rafi'uddin, Shah Abdul Qadir, and Shah Abdul Ghani. All of these 4 sons are from the second marriage, and he also had one daughter from his second marriage, and her name was Amatul Aziz. Shah Waliullah studied the standard books that were taught to aspiring students of knowledge in his time. And if we look at the list of those books, they concentrate on a few things. So fiqh was something that was taught. So he was taught fiqh. Usulul fiqh, to a very small degree, was something that was taught. Nahu, sarf, this was something that was taught. And then Persian poetry is something, Persian was Farsi, was the academic language of India at that time. So this was something that was taught. And as far as hadith is concerned, the vast majority of students of knowledge, and we're talking about Islamic students of knowledge, they didn't study hadith. Right? Or if they did study hadith, they studied, we have a book called Mishkatul Masabih. Mishkatul Masabih is currently in the subcontinent. This is usually taught in the second last year of the Fadila courses. So if you have a 7-year course, then this is the book that's taught in the 6th year. Mishkat al-Masabih is a collection of narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that are divided into they include narrations that have to do with fiqh, so they are divided in the areas of fiqh, basically, so Kitab al-Ibadat and onwards, and there are also other narrations included in that book, but this was about it, and it was considered like, Mishkatul Masabih today. For students of knowledge, it's important that there are only certain books of hadith that you can quote. So you know how there are rules for writing academic papers even in the West, that you have to cite certain things in certain ways. So move that to Islam. If you want to quote a hadith, you can't quote it from Mishkat. Why can't you quote it from Mishkat? Is when you're writing academically in the field of hadith, you need a book that includes the entire sanad, the entire chain of narrators. So, yes, just for the purpose of reading and for the purpose of sharing with one another, that's fine. You can quote from Mishkat, and you can quote from Riyadh al-Salihin, and you can quote from Fadail al-Amal, or whatever it is, right? But if you're writing a paper, you can't do that, right? So that tells you that basically there was nobody in the entire land that was academically qualified in the study of hadith, because the last book that they would study, if they studied any at all, was Mishkatul Masabih, right? So Mishkatul Masabih, we're not taking away from the importance of the book. It is a very important book, but it's not the last book that one should study. There are the 6 authentic books of hadith that come after that, which were not being taught in the Indian subcontinent at that time. Right? So in 1730 approximately, Shah Waliullah went for Hajj, and him going for Hajj itself, just making the journey of Hajj, this was considered very brave of him. I told you about the Marhata people. The only port that Hajis went for Hajj from was in Gujarat, right? So the port of Surat, right? Surat was the headquarters later of the East India Company, that's the colonial empire. But at that time, that was the main port of entry and exit towards the Arab lands, because it's the closest, right? So that's where Shah Waliullah went. And in order to get just to Surat, he would have had to cross territory occupied by these by looters and by the Marhata people and by any number of other things that could have happened to him. And even from there, once you get on the ship, it's not like you're safe, right? So you had Portuguese and French pirates in the waters, and you had the British also. So all of these, all of these people, they don't want to really let you go safely. And once you get to the other side, we already know what's happening in the Hijaz, right? So making your way for Hajj at that time was not something that was very easy to do. In fact, we still have many people. It was actually. This is unfortunately something that doesn't happen anymore because or maybe like it happens in a Facebook post or something. But we have a rich history of people actually writing their entire experience of Hajj, and we're talking about the physical experience as well as the spiritual experience. So there are scholars and there are lay people as well that have written their experience and their feelings of Hajj. Right? So in detail, so how they left, what preparations they made, how they got there, who they encountered, who they spoke to, how they felt, how they prayed, what they asked for, what was their feeling at that time, how they felt in Mina, in Arafah, all of these things they wrote about, right? And the sad thing is, in order to be able to write, you actually have to read. Today we don't read, so we don't write. So it's sort of a big circle. So I'm not even going to ask who read what I gave them, right? But inshallah. Over there at that time, Shah Waliullah, he had a number of sheikhs, but his main teacher was Abu Tahir Madani al-Kurdi. Abu Tahir Madani al-Kurdi, he was a Kurd from well, there is no Kurdistan, but that area. And he was al-Madani, he was in the city of Medina Munawwara. And if you look today, any scholar of hadith that has studied hadith in the subcontinent, right? Anyone, all of them, their chains, myself included, their chains of transmission, their isnad, go back to this man right here, Abu Tahir al-Madani al-Kurdi, rahimahullah. Because Shah Waliullah was the first person who brought that concept of isnad to India. So all of the chains of transmission from within India, Pakistan, this entire area over here, they go back to Shah Waliullah and his teacher, right? So this man, he is receiving mountains of reward in his grave. May Allah have mercy on him for bringing the sciences of hadith to an entire area of the world. An entire area of the world that was up until then deprived from hadith. And Sheikh Abu Tahir, actually, this man, his father, so Sheikh Abu Tahir al-Madani, his father was Sheikh Ibrahim al-Qurrani. Sheikh Ibrahim al-Qurrani, interestingly enough, he was a disciple and an ardent supporter of who? Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. Right? Ibn Taymiyyah. And later on in his life, Shah Waliullah also was an ardent supporter and defender, and he really looked up to Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. So we can assume that his sheikh and his sheikh's father was not around at that time, he had passed away, but they, this probably had something to do with it, because, since Abu Tahir was Sheikh Ibrahim's son, so the father must have, taught something to the child regarding his lifelong affiliation with Ibn Taymiyyah, and the Sheikh probably mentioned some of these things, although the primary focus was hadith, but he mentioned this to Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, and Shah Waliullah was a very big fan of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, a very big fan. There were other scholars as well, but he is the main teacher. In about 1145 of the Hijrah, Shah Waliullah began to teach the hadith in India. He began to teach the sciences of hadith, and it's the space where he was teaching. This was Madrasa Rahimiyya. So in the time of his father, Madrasa Rahimiyya was a small house. Now, once Shah Waliullah became well known and people came from all over the land to acquire hadith, because nobody was teaching hadith until that time. Nobody was teaching Bukhari, nobody was teaching Muslim, nobody was teaching these books until that time. He is the first person. So to acquire this sanad, this concept of the sanad, that your teacher and his teacher and his teacher and his teacher and his teacher is going all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, this was something that was strange in India. This was something that nobody had it. So everybody was coming, and Muhammad Shah, the Mughal ruler at that time, he gifted a vast house in Delhi to Shah Waliullah, right, to house the new madrasa in. Right? So it's, in fact, Muhammad Shah wasn't a great guy, so it's one of the few good things that he did in his whole life was gift this house to the madrasa. And the madrasa actually stood until the rebellion of 1857. The rebellion of 1857. So this is also called the first war of independence. So this was unsuccessful, but it's also called the mutiny. So the rebellion of 1857, the madrasa stood, and at that time the city was deserted to a large degree, and today the madrasa does not stand as it once stood at that time. There are actually houses and whatnot over there. Yes.
Sorry, where was this madrasa that was gifted to Shah Waliullah?
It's in Delhi. So Shah Waliullah's old madrasa was actually outside of the city, right? And this new madrasa was actually in the city. So I particularly don't know exactly where it is, but it's called Madrasa Rahimiyya. Yes, yes. So the madrasa actually doesn't stand as a madrasa anymore. I checked. So I believe that I had a conversation, was it with you? And I thought this madrasa did, but this madrasa actually doesn't stand as a madrasa anymore. Right? So there's no teaching going on over there. And the Shah Waliullah passed away on the 30th of Muharram in 1176 of the Hijrah. That's about 1763, Common Era. And he is buried in a graveyard called the Mehendiyan graveyard in Delhi. right? And this graveyard still exists, and it's behind. It's actually in quite a strange place. It's behind a huge hospital in Delhi, right? So if you want to go there, and it's the strange thing is that a lot of these historic sites, well, I'm not saying that his grave is a historic site, but a lot of sites of any significance to Muslims have not been very well protected and very well maintained by the Indian government, right? Except for like things that make them a lot of money, like the Taj Mahal and whatever. But apart from that, nothing. It's not there. They have not been very well maintained. Yes, there are some some masjids in India that have been designated as historical sites. So yes, the Indian government doesn't want to get in trouble by not protecting these areas, so they do to a degree that. So there are certain masajid in Ahmedabad, there are certain masajid in Delhi, but for the most part, many of the less well-known areas, they have not been maintained to a satisfactory degree. If we look at the life's work of Shah Waliullah, he concentrated his efforts in about 7 different areas that we should be aware about. We're not going to talk about all of them, but I will mention them briefly. Number 1 is Islahul Aqaid. Islahul Aqaid basically means correcting beliefs, correcting the aqidah of people, and calling them back towards the Quran. This is one category, correcting the beliefs of people and calling them back towards the Quran. Number 2 is his efforts in spreading the sciences of hadith in the Indian subcontinent. Number 3, his efforts in presenting the Sharia in a way that is understandable for people, and also dissecting the hidden wisdoms in the rulings of Sharia. So this leads to his book Hujjatullah al-Baligha that we'll talk about in a moment. He also spoke at length about the need for a khilafah, and this is something that he was quite passionate about, the need for establishing and maintaining and ensuring that a khilafah, a succession, continues. So he wrote about this, and he also addressed the rulers of his time regarding this. He was also very vocal about the politics of his time. So this is the 5th area. So concentrating on the rulers of his time and reform from the top down. So he actually worked both ways. So if you look at some of his ideas, they are grassroots. So they are from the bottom to the top, and he also did it the other way. So he worked on the rulers, and he tried to reform them from the top. And he had the 6th area over here is Hisba. Hisba basically means warning, or it means looking after the various and addressing the various classes of people from within the ummah. So I have a few letters of and addresses of Shah Waliullah that if we have time we will go through at the end, inshallah. And number 7 was, of course, the madrasa. So teaching his students at the madrasa in a number of disciplines. We'll talk about 3 things over here, inshallah. Number 1 is his concept of returning to the Quran and true aqidah. The reason he concentrated so hard on the true aqidah was because that aqidah was actually lost on many of the Muslims of that time, right? So they had strayed from the message. So basically, there are a number of reasons for this. Number 1 is, historically speaking, that entire area, it was, it's not just mushrikeen. That was like the headquarters of shirk in the world, right? So that, for centuries they had been mushrikeen. And even the Muslims that lived in India, their families and their ancestors, they were also mushrikeen, right? So living with the mushrikeen and mixing with them, and it's very different than here, right? So a lot of us might think that we live with mushrikeen and atheists and Christians and Jews, and it's not like we're losing everything, right? It's a little bit different. We're living, but we're brown, they're white. We're like 2 different groups of people over here, right? It wasn't like that over there. Everybody was from the same country. They didn't have anywhere to go back home to, and it's a very different circumstance that they were facing over there. So they were living with the mushrikeen, and many of the ways of the mushrikeen, they had crept into the Muslims because they were not strong in their aqidah. Yes, on the other hand, many of the ways of the Muslims, the positive ways of the Muslims, they also rubbed off on the mushrikeen, but it works both ways, right? Sufi practices. So Sufi practices. So I said that the concept of tazkiyah is something that the Sharia it emphasizes the purification of the self, and letting go of carnal desires and the diseases of the heart. All of these things, these are things that we actually find in the Sharia. The Prophet ﷺ concentrated on them, and the Sahaba, they were very well aware of these things. The ulama that came after them, they also concentrated on these things because everybody agrees that pride is a disease of the heart. Jealousy, malice, all of this is a disease of the heart, and it's something you have to work on. If everybody agrees on that, that means everybody agrees for the need of tasawwuf, because that's what tasawwuf is. Tasawwuf is you are working on reforming yourself, right? Reforming your heart, basically, preparing for your meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That being said, there were a lot of things that were now mixed in the name of tasawwuf that had nothing to do with the Quran and the Sunnah, right? So Shaykh Abul Hasan Ali al-Nadwi rahimahullah, he mentioned something very interesting over here. He said that if you analyze history, right, wherever Islam came directly from an Arab link, right, those people tended to remain on the aqidah, right? But wherever Islam came from an indirect link, those people, if they were not taught correctly and if they were not supervised, they tended to stray to the old ways, right? And India, the Islam that we're talking about that was present in India at that time, it didn't come directly from an Arab root. So yes, Islam did come to India in the Sindh area as a result of the Arabs, of the invasion of Muhammad bin Qasim, right? So we're not talking about that. So they didn't actually go any further. So they stopped there and they went back. And yes, that area, many people, they did become Muslim. But the majority of India, that's not how they became Muslim. Islam, it's not like it happened over there and then it spread to the rest of India. That's not how it happened, right? So that sort of stopped over there because people didn't exactly, travel all over the country at that time, right? You're lucky if you ever left your village. So that's just sort of how how it happened at that time. And the rest of the area, Islam came from where? It came from Iran, it came from Afghanistan, it came from all of these areas. So Shaykh Abul Hasan is not being racist. He's not saying that these people are bad and we shouldn't trust them. He's just making a historical observation over here. And another problem in India was the impact of so there are two philosophies that are sort of clashing, and both of them are philosophies of kufr and shirk, right? One is the Indians themselves. So they had ancient teachings and philosophies and thinkers that they had that had an influence on the people of that time. And then they were also sort of there was a leak from Iran and the time of Akbar, especially of the Iranian philosophers, and they were heavily influenced by who? By the Greek, right? And a lot of that, so what we call Hellenistic philosophy, is full of shirk, right? So it's if you don't know what you're looking at, that's the astaghfirullah. So some of those things. So a lot of our ulama, what they did is they sort of they sifted that for us, and they did. So there is a lot of benefit. So we're not saying that all of it is bad and we should throw it out. The translation movement of translating these things from Greek to Persian and from Persian to Arabic, this was a huge movement within the Muslim lands. So there is benefit, but at the same time, this gave birth, for example, to schools of Kalam, right? So Kalam is basically the study of Aqidah from a different perspective. So traditionally, Aqidah was studied from the way that you found it from your Salaf, right? That you get it from, you learn it from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his companions, and that is, the Aqidah that was passed on. Kalam had a sort of different approach. So it's not necessarily wrong, but it was different. And the Kalam movement was spurred by all of these different philosophies of that time. Shah Waliullah also authored a Farsi translation of the Quran. So this was also considered a monumental work of his time. And the reason for this is, things weren't the Quran was not actually translated into many languages up until that time. And Farsi was the academic language of India at that time. And Shah Waliullah, he translated the Quran into that language. And he also, he authored a brief pamphlet on Aqidah called Al-Aqidatul Hasana. And moving on to his efforts in Hadith. His efforts in Hadith, up until that time in India, there was no actual formal study circles of ahadith, right? So this isn't something that's existed in India. There was hadith, so it's not that the Indian subcontinent just didn't know what hadith was. But I mentioned that if somebody was lucky, they would have the opportunity to study Mishkatul Masabih. Now, one thing that's very interesting over here. Now, I'm mentioning this just because it's a historical fact and not because I'm Gujarati, okay? So the reason over here is that Gujarat was actually the only area of India that had a connection to the Sunnah, to basically the study of Hadith. And there are a number of reasons for this, and we meaning the comprehensive study of a hadith, not just a book here or there. So the reason for this was, number one, Gujarat was a port city, right? Surat, that area, it is a port city, and there was constant contact, whether between the ulama themselves, because Gujarat for a long time it was independent. The rulers of Gujarat in the 15th and for the vast majority of the 16th century, for about 75 years into the 16th century, they were actually independent from the Mughal Empire. So this was an independent dynasty, and many of their rulers, they were pious, God-fearing people who had much respect for the ulama and the scholars, and they housed them, they funded their research, their trips to the Haramain, their trips back, and their study over there. They funded their families. They did all of this because they understood the value of this. And also many Arab ulama, they did come to that part of India. So they wouldn't go all over India, but they did come there just because that was the port city, and they had the Hajj would take place from there. So there was some connection over there. And in that time, so one of the most famous books of hadith, hadith, basically the definitions of words used in the hadith as defined by the Sharia, basically. So, not just the linguistic definition, but what those words actually mean in the context of the Sharia. There is a book called Majma'u Bihar al-Anwar. Majma'u Bihar al-Anwar is a monumental work in this regard, where he defines many of the difficult words and concepts addressed by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the hadith. And surprise, surprise, this was written by a man by the name of Muhammad bin Tahir al-Fatani. Muhammad bin Tahir al-Fatan is the Arabic way of saying Patan. Patan is an area of Gujarat, and that's where he was from, and that's who wrote the book. And in fact, he wrote the book in the 16th century. So it's in order for him to be able to write that book, he has to have a very broad view of all of the ahadith and the sunan of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in order for him to make sense of what is being said, and he has to have a very comprehensive knowledge of the hadith, and that's exactly what he did. So the rest of India, they were more interested not in hadith. So the religious sciences that survived, the only actual science would have been fiqh. So because the Indians were predominantly Hanafi, so they did to a degree preserve the Hanafi school of fiqh, but that's about it, right? So they weren't concerned with how the Hanafi school relates to the hadith. that wasn't their concern. Just the mere rulings that this is fard, this is wajib, this is sunnah. That's it, right? And due to the ignorance of the sources of their faith, they fell into innovation and bid'ah. And one of the most famous books of that time is called Jawahir Khamsa. Jawahir Khamsa is written in Farsi by a famous Sufi sheikh called Muhammad Ghawth al-Kawaliyari. So if somebody's name is Ghawth, they're probably Sufi, right? So his name is Sheikh Muhammad Ghawth al-Kawaliyari. And this book is full of the sayings of various Sufi saints, and many of which directly contradict the Sunnah, by the way. And there are also many of the Sheikh's own experiments in the realm of spirituality and the mystical experiments that he has over there, all of which have absolutely no basis in the Quran and Sunnah. It also includes many strange salahs that he has prescribed, Salatul Ashiqeen and Salatul Tanweerul Qalb, and even the names are strange. But and of course, Jawahir Khamsa was by no means and the reason I'm mentioning this book is this book was actually quite is very famous. People loved this book. Everybody loved this book. Everybody had it inside their homes, and it was just it was like the Harry Potter of that time. Everybody loved it, right? So Jawahir Khamsa is not an oddball. There were many other things. So there was a concept of Sajdatul Tahiyya. Sajdatul Tahiyya is basically when you enter upon the Shaykh, you are going to make sujood in front of him as a way of saying salam to him. Right? And this was accepted, and this was in fact for a period of time until Aurangzeb. This was the way that it was done with the rulers as well, the Mughal rulers. That when you entered upon the Mughal rulers, you are going to not exactly make sujood, but bend down so far that you might as well make sujood, right? So that was their way. It was Aurangzeb that stopped that. They would gather. We have a debate today regarding milad, right? So whether milad is something that we do or we don't do. So forget about milad. They would gather on the birth and death anniversaries of their sheikhs at their grave sites, and there would be all sorts of things that happen over there at that time. Offering sacrifices to the dead. This was something that was very common at that time. Asking from the dead, so asking from Sheikh so and so who is sleeping peacefully. And we're not saying that these mashayikh are bad people, right? So during the course of their lives, they were probably wonderful people who worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the best of their ability. But after they died, people would ask from them, right? So a lot of this was going on at that time, and Shah Waliullah, he made an effort to sort of to combat a lot of this through his teaching of a hadith. And in fact, he wrote letters to many of. I have some of these letters. We probably don't have time to go through them, but I have some of these letters. He wrote letters to the children of these Sufi mashayikh, right? Because what his problem is that look, your parents, your father, he did something good when to the best of his knowledge, he was trying to help people during his life. But you guys are just totally off the map. You guys, you're not doing anything good. You're just sitting on the chair of your father and enjoying yourselves, and people are coming and they're asking you to make dua, and you're ripping them off. You're taking money from them. You're doing this. You're doing that. It's still happening in many areas of India and Pakistan. You just have to go there and see. So that's what was happening at that time, right? He wrote a number of books on the topic of a hadith. His most famous would have probably been Al-Musaffa. Al-Musaffa is a commentary on the Muwatta of Imam Malik in Farsi. The Sheikh was quite fond of the Muwatta, and the reason for his fondness of the Muwatta is the Muwatta was Sheikh Abu Tahir al-Kurdi. He was Maliki, right? He was Maliki, and the Muwatta was one of the books that Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, he actually regarded that he's narrated to have said actually himself that when a student masters the Arabic language, the first book that they should study is the Muwatta of Imam Malik, right? And the last thing that we'll talk about over here right now before wrapping up, inshallah, is his most famous book, the book that he's most well known for, and this is Hujjatullah al-Baligha. Hujjatullah al-Baligha, translated into the English language, is the conclusive argument from God. In this book, Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, he goes over in detail the wisdoms behind the various rulings of Sharia and what the Sharia wishes to accomplish by implementing these various rules. And Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, he was, this is a very, very, very difficult discipline to just to understand, let alone write in, right? So because it's something that you can easily make a mistake in, right? Understand, because many of these things, these are things that the word used in the Arabic language is asrar, right? Asrar sharia. These are secrets. So he's dissecting them from looking at the entire picture over here, not looking at individual rulings. That what through all of these rulings collectively, what is the Sharia trying to accomplish? What are the goals that the Sharia is trying to achieve by implementing all of these rules, right? And also individually, so if you read the muqaddimah, the introduction of the book, so this was part of the reading material that I gave you, that he gives a number of examples inside the muqaddimah of various individual wisdoms behind certain rulings. And he does make it clear that acting upon the rulings of Islam is not based upon your understanding their wisdom, right? That's something that needs to be understood. So something could make absolutely no sense to you, right? Right. So let's say that it makes no sense to you why you have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to pray Fajr, right? Absolutely no sense. It seems ridiculous, right? Na'udhu billah. Doesn't matter. Whether it makes sense to you or not, that's beside the point, right? Understanding them would cement your belief and give you a sense of tranquility, and would strengthen your belief. But even if you don't understand something's wisdom, you still have to practice it. The Sharia is not about what you feel good about doing, right? So that he makes that very clear, that acting upon the Sharia is not dependent upon understanding the wisdoms of Sharia, right? But understanding a ruling's wisdom, it does strengthen your iman, it strengthens your resolve, and it strengthens your perseverance. You understand why you are doing something. So that's one other thing that's important, that's interesting to note over here, that there are very few people, in fact, that have actually written in this discipline. So Shah Waliullah is one. The second famous book is, in fact, Shah Waliullah's is the second famous book. The first famous book was written by Shatibi rahimahullah. Imam Shatibi rahimahullah, 14th century, he died in 1388. He wrote a book called Al-Muwafaqat. Al-Muwafaqat. Al-Muwafaqat is the first book in this regard. And now we're not going to discuss his book over here, but what's interesting in both of these is 1388. Can anybody tell me, since we're all almost falling asleep, we'll just be about 5 more minutes inshallah, that what was happening in 1388 or around that time? Something interesting going on in the Muslim world. Yes?
Basel Empire being collapsed due to the
Something more particular. What was happening in Spain? Yes, so this is the decline of our existence in Spain, basically. So we weren't exactly gone yet, but this was the end, right, of Spain. So Imam al-Shatibi rahimahullah wrote his book during the dying days of the Andalusian Empire, and Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, he wrote his book during the dying days of the Mughal Empire, right? So why is this important over here? The reason it's important is both of these scholars, they thought it very important to understand the wisdoms behind your faith at times when your faith or your very existence is being challenged. So that brings us to us, that this is actually important for us too, because your faith is actually always being challenged, everywhere. You walk out the door, your faith is being challenged. And the media is challenging your faith, and just popular culture is challenging your faiths and your beliefs. And everything you believe seems to be wrong and backwards and belongs 2 centuries prior to when we're living right now. So the reason it's very important to study this is it gives you that conviction required to continue practicing your faith. So that is why both of these books were written at these specific times, right? In the introduction to so we already talked about that. So some of the concepts that he introduces, we'll go over them briefly. Has that book on irtifaqat was not included, right, in the reading material? Okay. So the concept of irtifaq, it comes from the word rifq. So this is actually a concept introduced, or introduced in this way, as in this holistic nature by Shah Waliullah rahimahullah. He says that in order for a society to achieve, success, just in their financial system, basically, in their and not just their financial system, but overall improve their standard of living, they need to work together to do this. So this is something that he introduced in a very principled way. He said it's not possible for this to be done individually. In order for a society to thrive, it's something that has, he actually introduced 4 stages to this, that in order for a society to strive and thrive, then you have 4 stages of what he calls irtifaqat, which is basically working together. So there is that book written by the student from Aligarh, right? So that explains it pretty well. So if somebody wants to read a little bit more about this, about irtifaq, then you can contact Brother Dostum over here, and he will send you in English book that discusses this concept over here. And Shah Waliullah also discusses contentment in the Hujjatullah al-Baligha. Contentment is, this is what everybody's looking for: tranquility, peace, contentment. How do you achieve it? He says that contentment has 4 principles. Number 1 is tahara. Tahara is cleanliness. Number 2 is humility before God. Number 3 is as-samaha. As-samaha means good morals, etiquette, and that whole living together, working together attitude. And number 4 is justice on both a micro and macro level, right? So justice in your own individual life, as well as justice to thrive within the society. These are the 4 principles upon which contentment is based, right? So if you want to achieve a sense of contentment, if you want to achieve a sense of peace and tranquility in your life, then these are the 4 things that you need. And in chapter 6 of the book, he discusses the need of humankind for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send them messengers and rusul. So this is also something that's very interesting, and this entire book actually has been translated into English, so this can be read. If anybody wants to read Hujjatullah al-Baligha in English, it is a little bit of a tough read, so take your time, and if you have any questions inside the book, you can contact any of your local scholars. You can contact me. The book is called in English The Conclusive Argument from God. The Conclusive Argument from God. So it's very hard to get your hands on. So the only copy I could find in Canada on Amazon was costing more than $300. Right? So it's like this size. Well, that's just because it's very rare, but the American Amazon has it, so you can get it from there for like 40, inshallah. So just don't buy it from the Canadian one, thinking that this probably costs $300 because it's such a good book. No, that's not why. It costs $300 because nobody has it, right? And he also discusses how to accomplish, in light of the Quran and Sunnah, the concept of ihsan. So ihsan is quite interesting because ihsan is Shah Waliullah's answer to the innovative the ways of the Sufis of his time, right? So we're not painting everybody with one brush here, but the innovative ways of the Sufis of his time, ihsan and that concept and the way to achieve that, this was his answer to that. right? This was his answer to that. So that, I don't know, that there were, there's mention of many strange things that were prevalent amongst the Sufis of Shah Waliullah rahimahullah's time, that are very strange, have nothing to do with the Quran and Sunnah. So it's more like, closing yourself in a room and turning the lights off and lighting a bunch of candles and hanging upside down and things like that, right? Nothing to do with the Quran and Sunnah. It's that's what was going on at that time, right? But Shah Waliullah, he did understand the need for tazkiyah and tasawwuf, but he just didn't agree with many of the practices prevalent in the people of his time, right? I mentioned many of them to you, and I'm sure all of these practices are things that even you and we don't agree with. That, gathering at people's graves and, performing sujood when entering upon mashayikh and things like this. This is something that no Muslim would agree with. But this was just because of how far the ummah had become from the pristine teachings of the Quran and Sunnah, that these things had crept up. So these are some of the things that Shah Waliullah was able to accomplish at his time. There is also his political involvement. He wrote to and he addressed many of the political leaders of his time regarding many of their own vices present in the rulers' lives, as well as the situation within the Muslim lands. He was particularly concerned with the Marhata people and how they were invading and taking Mughal territory, and he actually wrote to Ahmad Shah Durrani. He saw that the Mughal ruler is too weak to deal with this. So he wrote to Ahmad Shah Durrani next door in Kandahar, and he did come and he did help the Mughal ruler retake that territory. And it's a very interesting read. You should search and read about the third battle of Panipat, inshallah. The third battle of Panipat. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.